We're continuing our discussion about sampling distributions. This is the second video in the series of sampling distributions. If you remember, our first one talked more generally. It looked something like this. We saw how if we take consecutive and multiple samples, we'll get a sampling distribution. We have this nice mound-shaped symmetric kind of distribution. And that's all we could say at this stage, is that's mound-shaped symmetric. Well, in this video, we're going to get more specific. So there are really only going to be two shapes that we're going to talk about at this stage. Don't worry, there will be more to come. But at the moment, there'll be just two. And the sampling distributions will either be normal distributions or what are called T distributions, or I suppose neither. That's also a possibility. Distinguishing between the normal and the T, they actually look almost identical. Here's some pictures. Both are mound-shaped symmetric. Both look very much the same. Over here in this diagram is where you actually can compare the two. The one that I've highlighted red is the normal distribution. And the other ones are T distributions. So you can see that in general, there's sort of a smaller maximum. You have thicker tails, as it's called. The T distribution represents more variation. When things are more spread out. T distributions are more spread out. Now you'll notice that there's more than one T distribution. Another thing which is a little bit different about T distributions is that they have what's called this degree of freedom, which we're going to get into a little bit more specifically in a little bit. But in general is very closely related to the sample size. So degree of freedom is, for many things, just the sample size minus 1. And I think we talked about the reason for this in another video. I think it was during probability, actually. And so we have, degree of freedom of 9 means there's actually 10 data measurements. Degree of freedom of 2 means there are 3 data measurements. And you can see as the degree of freedom goes up, so this is degree of freedom of 2, this is the degree of freedom of 9. As the degrees of freedom goes up, the T distribution actually approaches the normal distribution. So that's just a little bit on T versus normal. Everything that we have done with the normal distribution, getting z-scores, there are T distribution versions of all that, and you work with it very much the same as the normal distribution. So the real question that we're going to address in this video is under what conditions will the sampling distribution be approximately normal or approximately T or neither? All right? The word approximately is actually pretty important because more often than not, it's not exactly the normal distribution or the T distribution, but it's close enough for us to use it. So, but when do we know? That's the complicated part. And hopefully you found on the website you've printed up something that looks something like this, which unfortunately looks a little intimidating. But it does break down into some fairly simple component parts. For example, really, are we talking about means or proportions? And we'll figure out what the difference is between those two. After that, are we talking about one sample or two sample? And once we get past one sample or two sample, is it then normal or a T distribution? And of course that. So this is the basic structure that we're going to be going through. And these boxes, sort of at the end of the tree, are what you use to determine whether it's a normal or a T distribution. And so let's, at this point, go through some examples. Here are two examples, and I'll let you read through them. You can pause the video, read them at your leisure. essentially this is summer employment. We have the average summer income for males, average summer income from females, and we want to know, is this statistically different or not? You know, just because these are different numbers doesn't actually make them statistically or at least significantly different. We know that any samples will vary, so maybe this difference is natural variation. Over here, example B, right, we have a poll of 1,048 randomly selected 13 to 17-year-olds, and we're given, you know, this result of 692 had a television in the room. This 198, naming Fox as the favorite, is actually, we're not really using that for this particular question, because the question is there convincing evidence that more than half, this is a key word right here, of all teenagers have a television in their room. So let's start asking ourselves those basic questions. So first of all, question number 1, are we talking about means or proportions? We'll do a little compare and contrast between the two different examples. So in example A, are we talking about means or proportions? Well, you can actually see X bar, that's a pretty big tip-off, that we're talking about means. And so in that chart, we're going to be going on to the means section. For B, let's get this up. The proportion sometimes is confusing, and so, you know, we're given the total amount, we're given the number that have TVs in the rooms, and so really it's going to be the ratio of the two, 692 over 1,048. That's a proportion which could be expressed, as it says down here, as a percentage. All right, so that can throw people too. If you're told, you know, 68% have TVs, it's really kind of the same question. It's only given to you as a percentage, but the same kind of thing. You're talking about what proportion of the sample, you know, has TVs. Well, 692 out of 1,048, and so this is a proportions kind of question. Now, question number 2. Is it one sample or is it two sample? In question number, or letter A, right, it's two sample, and what distinguishes two sample from one sample is, are we comparing two samples against each other, or are we comparing a sample against a population or some fixed known absolute number? So here, we just have two samples. We want to know, are these two samples the same or are they different? And so this would be a two sample question. And in B, the TVs, this is a one sample question, because we only have this one sample of 1,048, produces one proportion, and we're comparing that against, again, this known sort of absolute number of 1/2. So as I say, I think down here. All right. So sometimes you're going to be comparing a sample against a population, and sometimes you're going to be comparing a sample against some absolute known quantity like 1/2, and both of those are one sample kind of questions. Now there's a third question which often distinguishes between normal and t-distributions, and that's, is the population standard deviation known? In question A, no. Only the lowercase s, the sample standard deviation, is given. We really have no idea what the true population standard deviation is. So all we have is sample standard deviation, which, as we know, is larger than population standard deviation. So we're going to have more variation given our measure of variation being sample standard deviation. So already you could probably anticipate, well, if this is going to produce greater variation, is greater variation between normal and t-distributions, which has greater variation. Talked about this when I first showed it to you, t-distribution has greater variation. So if you don't know the actual true population standard deviation, it's kind of pointing towards a t-distribution. And in example B, also, I mean, we have no idea what the true standard population for the teenagers that have TVs in the room is. So also, it's a no on the population standard deviation. So now we can identify the possible shape that the sampling distribution might have. There's two distinct parts to, or phases to this question of shape. We can identify the possible shape. Notice my use of possible, because once we've identified what it could be, we then actually have to verify that it is in fact reasonable to use that shape, which is what those boxes at the end of the tree allow us to do. So here we have our example A, our three questions, which I've abbreviated here. And as we can see, question 1, we're dealing with means, so we go to the bottom part, only showing kind of the lower half because it's kind of a big chart, as you know. And then question 2, right, we're dealing with 2 samples, so we're moving in this direction. So we kind of go this way. And then question 3, we have our standard deviation is unknown, and we'll notice right here it says population standard deviation is unknown. So that means we're going in this direction. The population standard deviation is a key one that differentiates, but in fact we're going to have to verify all 4 of these, not just number 2, right, which is going to be our next step. But what we can say right now is the population, or the possible shape is going to be a t-distribution or nothing. All right? If these 4 elements don't check out, then we don't have a t-distribution and we don't have a normal distribution. We have nothing that we can identify. So verifying using these 4 becomes very important. And here we have going through the 4 different points here. Here's the 4. Right? And so we have, are they independent, simple, random samples? This is going to come up a fair amount in these verifications. If we go back and reread the question, it doesn't really say how they took the samples. So, not explicitly mentioned in the question, what we're going to do, and this is this typical statement that you kind of see oftentimes, we're going to proceed with caution because we don't know. We kind of hope that they did, and so there's going to be a little caveat at the end that we can get whatever results we get, but it's contingent that they actually did take a simple random sample. If they didn't, then our results really don't apply. We don't know population standard deviation, and again, we weren't given the data, so it's kind of important to know whether there are outliers or not in the sample, but we weren't given the sample. So again, here's this proceed with caution. It's all we got, right? We just have to say if there are outliers that could cause trouble. And this one, population is approximately normal. Yeah, we're saying this an awful lot, aren't we? Yeah, that happens because we don't know the population. It doesn't seem unreasonable that it would be approximately normally distributed, but we don't really know, so we have to proceed with caution. Which means the shape of the sampling distribution for example A is done on a t-distribution. So that's the shape of the sampling distribution. If we look at example B, we can do the same thing. We can identify and verify. Here we have our 3 questions. We're dealing with proportions. Now we're dealing with one sample. And notice, we're kind of connecting the dots here, that third question was about knowing the population standard deviation. When we're dealing with proportions, the population standard deviation doesn't really come in to this list. So it actually doesn't really make too much difference. Choosing between normal and t-distribution is kind of easy on the proportion side because we don't really cover the t-distribution. It gets complicated and beyond the scope of this class. So it's either really going to be normal or nothing. So we're going to check out whether it's normal or not by checking out these three possible verifications. Let's look at what they are, right? We had that whole same simple random sample business. We have these. These are now much more so mathematical checks about sample size and proportion. Multiplying them together has to be bigger than 10. And this is n times, what sometimes we call q, which is the opposite of p. This is 10 times the sample size. Is the population at least 10 times bigger than sample size? And if it is, then that would be okay. Let's look at, first of all, the numbers. I summarized them over here. We know that our sample size is 1,048. Calculated our proportion that has TVs, which turns out to be 66% of those surveyed have TVs. So we can plug those numbers in. I plugged in my n and my p, n and 1 minus p, so 34% don't have TVs. Now clearly both of those are much greater than 10, so that's not a problem. Check. We have, what's 10 times the sample size? 10,480. It is reasonable to assume that the population of teenagers is greater than that. So we have that verified. So these three have all checked out. And we can say, therefore, that the sampling distribution is approximately normal, which means that we can draw a sampling distribution and know that this is normal. If you remember, this is a t-distribution. So we can draw a t-distribution. There's the center. And by drawing them by hand, of course, there's really not a big difference. But if I label them, this is the normal, this is t-distribution, you know that the t-distribution is a little bit wider, depending a bit on the degrees of freedom. And notice that when we were talking about these sampling distributions, we had to get 44 samples in order to get a decent picture about the shape. Well, how many samples did we have to take with this one? Well, really, it was one big sample that they grouped, and we have our distribution. All right, here we have just one sample, but we have the whole. We don't need 44 samples to know the shape, right? Because we have all these wonderful criteria. This whole chart. If we use this, that means we don't need to take the 44 samples. We can get the shape without.